G'day, I'm Alister Christie and welcome to my DelphiCon presentation entitled Code Faster in Delphi. This also happens to be the title of my new book, which is all about being more productive in the Delphi IDE. I'm going to share some of my productivity insights with you over the next half hour, but of course I can only cover a tiny fraction. For the rest, you'll need to buy a copy of my book. Go to learndelphi.tv/codefaster. I'm going to start with some keyboard shortcuts in the Delphi code editor. In my book, I have a section that spans 10 pages of keyboard shortcuts, so we're only going to have time to look at a fraction. Knowing these shortcuts in the IDE can save you an enormous amount of typing and pointless waving around of the mouse. I always get a bit of a buzz when I learn a new shortcut, so I hope you find the following a hive of excitement. Let's just open an existing project. And I'll just make a quick mention. You can use the buttons in the IDE, such as the toggle form unit, to go between the source and the form designer. But you should learn the shortcuts. So it's F12, so we'll use the F12 key. Using the keyboard shortcuts will save you a little bit of time each time you use it. Using the mouse is quite slow for interacting with the IDE. If you can keep your hands on the keyboard, you'll save a lot of time. So I'd recommend learning as many shortcuts as you can for sort of common IDE tasks. Now, if I write a procedure, I can implement that with the class completion, just Control-Shift-C, and we'll see that's implemented the procedure and put the cursor where we want to start typing. It also works for properties. So let's do read FDX, and so we'll have a field and a setter. And I'll just press Control-Shift-C, and that's implemented that and even written the code for us and created, and I'll just go Control-Click on that, and we see it's put a field in automatically for us in the private section. So that's class completion. I use it every day. Another thing along similar lines is the synchronized prototypes. If I add a defunct I'm after and press Control-Alt-P, so our implementation is now different from our interface. But if I press Control-Alt-Shift-P, it synchronizes those, and that works from both locations. So if you don't believe me, and then we have it synchronizing the methods. Now I use this quite regularly. I find it quite helpful. There is a refactoring for adjusting parameters, but I find this a lot quicker. Now you've already seen me use the Control-Shift down arrow to navigate between the implementation and interface, and Control-Shift down, Control-Shift up do the same thing, so I can use the same key to go between them. That also works in the uses, so I can go between the interface and implementation of the uses. Another quick way of finding the uses is we can go in here, and there's a bunch of locations in our source code, and I find that's pretty much all I use this for, is to go find the implementation and interface of the uses. Another thing, if I like Control-Click on a few things to navigate to them, we can then go backwards and forward navigating the code with the Alt, left and right arrows. So these are the history buttons. Normally there's some history buttons up here, but I hide them because I've never used the buttons or use the keys. So we can navigate to previous locations in our code by using the Alt left arrow and right. And on a similar note, bookmarks are very handy. So I can come in here and, for instance, add a bookmark by pressing Control-Shift-1. And I could add another one here, Control-Shift-2, and Control-Shift-3. So I've got 3 bookmarks, and I can then just press Control-1, 2, or 3 to go to those locations in the source code. Now, if you want sort of bookmarks on steroids. If you go into the Get It package manager, you can install the bookmarks plugin, which adds a bunch of additional features, including just being able to press Control B to install a bookmark. I mentioned earlier about disabling the navigation buttons, these browser buttons, and you can enable and disable any of the groups of buttons that you like. And by default, they actually are on a separate line, but if you shove them all up onto the same line as the menu bar, you get a little bit of extra space for source code, which is good. And disable that. Now, also, you can customize the buttons that are visible. For instance, I've added this toggle language exceptions or notifications, and you can go in, and if you just go find what button you want, let's go find references, for instance, and throw that somewhere. You'll see there's a little, it swaps to a little between a cross and a plus, so we can add that button to our group here, and to remove it, we just drag it off. So I'd actually encourage you to remove any buttons that you don't actually use very often. And of course, you want to be using the keyboard shortcuts. I still have the run button here because the Camtasia defaults to F9 being start screen recording. And so I kind of leave the run buttons there. But otherwise, I just use the keyboard shortcuts. Let's do a few more keyboard shortcuts. And if we have, say, for cell mine, and we want to group these ones together, we could put, traditionally, we could do bracket there and then navigate to here and do the bracket. Or if I just select the code I want to have the brackets around, I can just press the left open bracket and it will automatically put the right open bracket around the where we want it. The other shortcut I'll mention is Control W. So that progressively selects wider and wider scope, and I could, then use our smart surround like so, although still require a little bit of editing. Now the smart surround works with the curly bracket as well, so I could set that as a comment, although it does do funny things with the formatting, but that's okay. I would use the Control/ typically to comment out a block of code. And of course it works with brackets too. If I highlight something at random, we can add square brackets around it. If I select this block of code and release the mouse, I can adjust the end of the selection with the holding down the shift and pressing down arrow or left and right and what have you. But if I actually wanted the begin at the top as well, I'd have to sort of reselect and then sort of reaching for the mouse, and it's all quite slow. But if I press Control QB, that moves the cursor to the beginning of the block, and I can then change the selection of the code. And likewise, I can go Control QK to go to the end of the block selection, and so on. Carry on with the selection theme. Holding down the Shift key while we navigate allows us to select a chunk of code. But if I also hold down the Alt key, so Alt Shift, and navigate, we can select a block of code. And for instance, I can delete that. I find this useful. Quite often I'll have a number of lines of code that are a single character out of sort of incorrect indentation, and sometimes the block selection gets toggled on. You can actually change the toggle by going Control OK, and it goes us back to regular selection. But as I was saying, with the indentation, if I do Tab and Shift Tab, that'll move two characters, and likewise the traditional Control Shift U and I for the sort of old indent keys. they're not going to get us into the right sort of location. You can indent right to the end and then back again, like so. Oops, like that. But another way of doing it is if I just hold down the Alt key with the mouse, I can select a single column of characters and re-indent them correctly, like so. That's probably enough editor shortcuts. If we navigate to the top of the file, I know that a lot of people, including myself, like to have each of the uses on its own line. Now, we could manually do this, but there's a much better way of doing it. If we go into Tools, Options, down to the language formatter and go into Delphi. Let's go line breaks and find the line breaks in the uses, and it's currently set to as is. So we'll say line breaks and uses yes, and save that. And I'm just going to press Control D on the keyboard. And this is the code formatter, and that will automatically format all our code in the entire unit. We can actually just have it, I can just select a block and format that block. So if you're manually formatting your code, using the Control D shortcut can be far quicker. I don't use it as much as I should, partly because sometimes there might be some formatting where things are lined up for readability rather than in a standard way. So let's move on to some form designer shortcuts and tips. So I'm just going to create a new VCL application and say no to that. In my book, I have a whole chapter on tips and shortcuts for the Delphi Form Designer. I'm going to share some of them with you now. My favorite is one that hardly anyone seems to know, and it's how you can shift a control, such as a panel, when it's filled with other controls, and you can actually click on it. So you can actually you're able to select it and move it with the mouse. It's something that's much easier to demonstrate than describe, so watch out for it. Let's add some controls to our form in the tool palette. So if I wanted to add an edit, I could double click on it, or I could click and drag and drop it. If I wanted to control its size as well, I can actually just select the control and drag it onto the form. Now, if I wanted to add, say, 5 buttons, if I shift click on the button, we'll see that's got this blue line around it. I can just keep going until I press escape or select a different control. Oops, no, I have to select a different control. But typically, I'll often use the Control-Alt-P shortcut and just type in the control I want. And we can just keep typing controls like so. There is, in the properties, and in my book, I go into a bit more detail about some of these properties, but if I turn on the persist search filter and type in button, the text stays, and I can just add a whole bunch like so. And let's toggle that back. A really common task is to clear the text in a edit box, and we can do that just by going down and deleting the property. Alternatively, I can right click and just go clear text. So you'll see we've got clear text, right justify, and so on. And that those various things, they also appear down in the bottom of the object inspector, but I have that disabled on my machine. If I right click on the button, we can go into the quick edit, and this is now available in FireMonkey as well, which is quite nice. And we can adjust the name and caption, and also say the alignment. I can set that align to top, and if it's a bit bigger, and let's go quick edit, align left. Okay, so now we've got all these buttons in our panel, and let's say I now want to move the panel. I can't actually select the panel or click on it. I can select it in the structure view, but I can't move it very readily. I can use the shortcut keys, so I can hold down, oops, and I can use the shift arrows to resize and control to move around. But that's pretty slow. What I can do is click and hold on the button and then press escape, and that will select the panel, and then I can move it to where I want it. Let's say I want to line all these buttons up. I could either select them all in the structure view, or I could drag to select and unselect the edits. Now, if we want to line up with, say, button 4, if I click on button 4, you'll see it's got the black dots around it rather than the grey ones. Likewise, if I click around, and we can select position and then align, and then we can align the left sides. And we could also space them equally vertically. Oh, and we also had a label there which we didn't want. I'll just make a quick mention of the VCL guidelines. We can see when I'm moving controls around, the blue lines highlight whether we're aligned with the top edges or bottom edges, and the pink line indicates whether we are lined up with the text. Now, you can also, if I just have the control selected, I can hold down the control key or the shift key, and that'll bring up the guidelines as well. So, and we can adjust things with the keys as well. If I had wanted, say, this button 1 to be part of on this panel, I could press Control X and then Control V to put it on there, or we can use the structure view and I can drag and drop it between the various containers. So it's now on the form, but I can drag and drop it onto the panel as well. Sometimes you might put the wrong control on a form, but only realize later, or you want to change the type of control. And for instance, this T button, let's say we actually wanted a speed button on the form. So this is a button 10, so I'll just copy that to the clipboard. And normally I press Alt F12 to view the source, but that seems to have become broken in Delphi 10.4, but we can right click and go View as Text and find our button 10 and make it a speed button, and then Alt F12 should go back, and even says it should, but we'll have to do it manually. Now, speed buttons don't have a tab order property because they can't get focus, so it's going to give us an error, and we just go ignore, and we see that now our button is now a speed button. However, in the source code, our button 1 down here still says T button. So I can just like compile it or save it, and it will prompt us to make the change. And now our button is a speed button. Similarly, I can take a button and copy it to the clipboard and paste it into Notepad. And I could also make this a speed button. Copy that back to the clipboard, and let's go back and remove that tab order. And there we have 3 speed buttons. One last tip for the form designer. If I highlight these buttons, and we can come in here into the search box for the object inspector and type in caption. I'll press enter, and we can update the caption. And if we have multiple things in the object inspector, I can just press enter and then use the up and down arrow to select the one I want. In this next section, I want to take a look at improving some legacy code by taking advantage of additions to the RTL and some new language features. I have here a very simple application that lists files in the ctemp folder. So we're just using find first and find next to iterate through all the file names. And we're just grabbing files, but not directories. So if we go ahead and run that, we see that it does indeed do what we expect. And I've got lots of old files, some of which are possibly decades old, in my temp folder. But this is kind of old school, and we could probably improve it somewhat. And to do that, I'll start by adding system.io utils to our uses. And we can use tdirectory.getFiles and specify the temp folder. And we could specify the star.star in the search pattern, but it does star.star by default, so that's fine. And we'll need a file names variable. I just need to remove the system from that. And then we can iterate over those file names. And that more or less does the same thing. And it's about the same number of lines, but we don't need at the beginning and there. But I think this is a little bit easier to read and understand. And we'll just verify that it does indeed do the same thing, although it's grabbing the directory. So let's go and verify that does what we want. Excellent. So we've now pretty much got the same behavior as before. Now we can further simplify and shorten this code by taking advantage of inline variables. Go var and like so, and then we no longer need that, and I'll just check that compiles. Indeed it does, and we can run that and confirm that it still does exactly as before. But so that's reduced the number of lines of code, but each line is now a little bit confusing by having these types in here, which we can now actually omit because of another feature that's been added to Delphi recently, or Delphi 10.3, and that's type inferencing. So we've now removed the types, and it's automatically determined by the compiler because we're returning a value from a function, and so the compiler can tell that that should be a t-array of strings, and likewise this should be a string. And we can validate that, still works, and works exactly as before. Now, personally, I think this is more concise and easier to read than the previous code. It also has the advantage of the fact that this file name variable is only accessible in this for loop. So if I try to go something like this, we'll see that this is not in the scope of the procedure, only the for loop. So it can help with making variables only available where you actually need to use them. So that's all I wanted to cover in this example. Let's move on. Next, we build a simple application for a fictitious project and look into the power that regular expressions can bring to your applications. Let's just pretend that you've been tasked with getting the URLs for all the images in this web page, or JPEGs. And you could go through and right-click on each image and go copy link address and then paste that into Notepad or something similar. But as we are programmers, we know there are faster ways of doing such things. So let's have a look at the source for the page and find all the JPEGs. And we can see that there are 112 of them. And basically we want to extract these URLs. And we can see that they begin with HTTPS and end with .jpg. So let's build an application to do just this. We need some way of downloading the web page. Now, You could use either the Indie ID HTTP component, but I always have fun with getting SSL working with that correctly. Or we could use the Net HTTP client and request. And we just link those together. So let's throw a button on the form. So from the client, we can just call get, and then we need to specify a URL. And so let's go back to our web page. Grab that URL. And it returns a response. And we can grab the content as string and throw it into the web text. Now, we'll also just update our GUI, and we'll throw a list box in there and make that nice and big. We're now going to want to parse this variable. It's a string, and we want to extract all the URLs from it. Now, that's string parsing. That's the domain of regular expressions. So we'll add the system.regularExpressions to our uses. And we want to determine all the matches in our web page. And then we need to specify a regular expression. And we pretty much know it's going to begin with https:// and it's going to end in .jpg. Now, dot is a special character, so we need to escape it. And then we need some magic content in the middle here. And I'm just going to copy and paste it in, because I'm lazy. So basically, this is the internals of the URL. It's I think the domain name and any folders. So from there, we want to iterate through all our matches, and we want to add the items to our list box. We'll add match.value, and of course we don't need the begin end because we've only got one line of code in there. And just to make sure things are going right, we'll do a show message, and we'll display the count, the total number of things we've found. Now, if I've written that correctly, let's run that. And there's all our URLs, and it says we've got 112. And quickly scroll through those. And if we go back to our web page, we see that we did indeed have 112. Now, let's pause for a minute and think about what we've written, which is only a total of 6 lines of code. And we've downloaded a web page, and in 3 lines of code, extracted every JPEG URL within it. Just think how much code you would have had to have written had you used basic string commands such as pause, copy, and delete. It would be a lot. Knowledge of the RTL, and in this case regular expressions, can save you a significant amount of time, as demonstrated. Thanks for watching to the end of my presentation. I hope you had lots of "I didn't know Delphi did that" type moments. If so, you'll probably both enjoy and benefit from my book, Code Faster in Delphi. I'm Alister Christie, and I hope to catch you in a future video.